Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Cracking open that comparative politics textbook can feel like climbing Mount Everest sometimes, especially when you hit a chapter like Chapter 10 on comparative public opinion.
Yeah, it's a bit dense, isn't it?
Yeah, but no worries. We're
Yeah.
here to make this climb a little smoother, a little more enjoyable. And to guide us on this intellectual trek, we've got our amazing expert here with us.
Hey everyone.
Now, before we get started, I just wanted to quickly say that we're going to be focusing on the main ideas and concepts from Chapter 10 in this deep dive.
Ah,
So if you're looking for a quick refresher before an exam or just want to get a better grasp on the material, you're in the right place. So in a nutshell, this chapter dives into how people in different countries think about political issues. Why do some countries seem to lean more towards certain ideologies than others? What shapes those opinions? Are we all just products of our environment?
that's a really good question. It's actually one of the core questions that comparative public opinion researchers try to answer.
So how do we even begin to compare opinions across countries? I mean, people speak different languages, have different cultures. It seems like a pretty daunting task.
It definitely can be, but that's where the beauty of comparative public opinion research comes in. It's not just about looking at what people think, it's about understanding the why behind those thoughts. And that why often lies in the fascinating interplay of culture history and institutions.
Okay, so we're not just comparing apples and oranges here. We're trying to understand why those apples and oranges taste different in the first place.
Exactly. And that's what makes this feel so fascinating.
Now, I'm seeing in the chapter they mentioned that this field of study has actually been around for a while. It's not brand new.
No, you're absolutely right. It's been gaining momentum since the 1950s, with organizations like WAPR, the World Association for Public Opinion Research, connecting scholars from around the world.
Oh yeah, WAPR. I remember seeing that acronym in the chapter.
Right.
What exactly do they do?
Well, basically, they work to ensure that we're collecting and analyzing data in a way that's reliable and comparable across different countries, especially in emerging democracies where polling might be a relatively new concept.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're talking about apples to apples comparisons again. But speaking of comparisons, this chapter dives into three different levels of analysis:
Yeah.
conceptual, operational, and measurement. To be honest, those sound a bit intimidating.
Oh, they're not as scary as they sound. Let me break them down for you.
Okay, please do, because my brain is already starting to hurt.
So think of the conceptual level as defining what we're actually studying. What do we mean when we talk about something like housing, for instance?
I guess housing means different things in different places.
Exactly. In a sprawling American suburb, it might mean a detached single-family home with a yard. But in a dense Asian megacity, it could mean a high-rise apartment. So researchers have to make sure everyone's on the same page about what they're actually comparing.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's all about making sure we're talking about the same thing before we even start comparing opinions.
Precisely.
What about the operational level? What happens there?
So once we have a clear definition of what we're studying, we need to figure out how to actually measure it. That's the operational level. It's about turning those big ideas into concrete questions that we can ask people in surveys.
Ah, so it's like translating those concepts into a language that everyone can understand.
You got it. It's about finding ways to ask questions that are meaningful and comparable across different cultures.
I'm starting to see how tricky this can get. And then finally, we have the measurement level, right? What goes on there?
Measurement is all about making sure that the data we collect is actually reliable and comparable across countries. We need to be confident that the answers we're getting are actually reflecting what people think and not just some quirk of how the question was asked or who was surveyed.
So it's all about making sure those apples are truly comparable apples.
You could say that.
Okay, so we've got our definition straight. We know how to measure opinions across cultures. But now the big question: where do our political opinions even come from? I mean, I have pretty strong beliefs about certain issues, but where did those beliefs come from? Did I just pull them out of thin air?
No, you're not alone in wondering that.
Yeah.
It's a question that's fascinated political scientists for ages, and it takes us into the realm of political socialization.
Ooh, socialization. Sounds fancy.
Well, it's actually a pretty straightforward concept. It's basically the process of how we form our political beliefs. It starts in childhood and continues throughout our lives.
So it's not like we're just born with our political opinions hardwired into our brain.
No, not at all. We learn and absorb those opinions from the world around us. Think of it like a sponge, soaking up information and values from everything around it.
So we're all just little political sponges running around.
Uh-huh. In a way, yes. But it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's also about how we interpret that information, how our experiences and the people around us shape how we view the world.
The chapter mentions something called agents of socialization, which are the people and groups that influence our political views. I'm curious about which ones are the most impactful. Where do we start picking up these political ideas?
Well, think about it. When you're a kid, who are you surrounded by? Who shapes your early understanding of the world?
I guess my family mostly.
Exactly. Family is often the most powerful agent of socialization, especially early on. Think about all those dinner table conversations, the family traditions, the stories we hear growing up. It all shapes how we view the world, including the political world.
I never really thought about it like that. But it makes sense. Our family kind of gives us our first taste of politics.
They really do. They pass on their values, their beliefs, their voting habits. It's like inheriting a political legacy, whether we realize it or not.
Wow, that's a powerful image. But it's not just family, right? We eventually break out of that bubble and encounter other influences.
Exactly. As we get older, our world expands. We go to school, we make friends. We get exposed to new ideas and different perspectives. And all of that can challenge our preconceived notions and force us to rethink our political beliefs.
So education is a big one too.
Absolutely. Education isn't just about learning facts and figures. It's about developing critical thinking skills, being exposed to diverse viewpoints, and learning to evaluate information for ourselves.
That's so important, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
It really is. And speaking of influences, we can't forget about religion. It plays a significant role in shaping political attitudes as well. It's not always in predictable ways.
Right. Religion and politics can be a bit of a tricky mix.
They can be. But religious values often intersect with political issues in really interesting ways. And those intersections can lead to a wide range of political perspectives.
It's a reminder that people's political views are often deeply intertwined with their core beliefs and values.
Exactly. It's not just about logic and reason. It's about what matters to us at our core.
What about those really big life-altering events, like 9/11 or living through a pandemic? Do those have a lasting impact on our political outlook?
Absolutely. They can be incredibly powerful in shaping how we view the world and our place in it. Think about it. Living through something like a war or a natural disaster can fundamentally change how you see things.
Like your priorities might shift or you might become more skeptical of certain institutions.
Exactly. It's not just about what we're told, it's about what we experience. For instance, someone who lived through a period of economic hardship might have a very different view of government intervention than someone who grew up during a time of prosperity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
So our experiences, both personal and collective, can have a huge impact on our political views.
they really can. It's all part of that ongoing process of political socialization. We're constantly learning, growing, and adapting our views based on what we see and experience in the world around us. And sometimes those shifts in perspective can happen really quickly, like after a major event or a crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. Things can change in an instant. So we've talked about how these opinions are formed, but how do we actually go about measuring them? It's not like we can just read people's minds.
No, we can't, unfortunately. But that's where the art and science of public opinion polling comes in. It's one of the main tools we use to try to gauge what people are thinking.
I can imagine. There are tons of polls out there, but how do they actually work? And are they really a reliable way to measure what an entire country thinks?
That's a great question, and there are definitely limitations to polls. But they can be pretty accurate if they're done correctly. The basic idea is that we select a small but carefully chosen group of people to represent the views of a much larger population. It's kind of like tasting a spoonful of soup to judge the flavor of the entire pot. You don't need to eat the whole pot to get a good sense of what it tastes like.
That's a good analogy. So in polling, we're essentially taking a taste of public opinion to see what the overall flavor is. But how do we make sure that this small group we're surveying actually reflects the views of the entire population?
That's where the magic of randomization comes in. Everyone in the population needs to have an equal chance of being selected for the survey. That helps to minimize bias and increase the likelihood that our sample accurately reflects the larger group we're interested in.
It sounds like there's a lot of statistical know-how involved in getting this right.
There definitely is. But the key takeaway is that the more random our sample is, the more confident we can be that it represents the population as a whole.
So even with a perfectly random sample, we're still just looking at a small slice of the population, right? How do we account for that?
That's where the margin of error comes in. It's a statistical measure that tells us how much the sample results might differ from the true opinions of the entire population. Think of it like a buffer zone around the poll results. It gives us a sense of how much wiggle room there is.
Okay, so it's not an exact science, but it gives us a pretty good idea. What about those online polls we see popping up everywhere these days? Are they reliable too?
Online polls can be useful for getting a quick sense of what people are thinking about a specific topic, but they often lack the rigor of those traditional randomized polls we were just talking about.
So they're not as scientific.
Exactly. They're more susceptible to certain biases, like self-selection bias, where only people who feel strongly about an issue bother to respond, and that can skew the results.
I can see how that would happen.
Yeah.
So it seems like those traditional polls, especially those using random digit dialing or RDD, are still considered the gold standard.
Yeah.
But even with those high standards, there's still potential pitfalls to watch out for, right?
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that polls are just snapshots in time, and public opinion is constantly changing. What people think today might be different from what they think tomorrow.
So we can't just take poll results as gospel truth.
Exactly. We need to be critical consumers of polling data. We need to think about the context, the way the questions are worded, the timing of the poll. All those factors can influence the results.
It's like those optical illusions, where the same image can be perceived in multiple ways depending on how you look at it.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of things that can influence how we perceive things, let's talk about priming and framing. These are two really interesting concepts that can affect how people respond to polls.
Oh yeah, those sounded especially tricky in the chapter.
Yeah.
Can you break those down for us? Give us some real-world examples.
Of course. Let's say a pollster wants to gauge public opinion on government spending. If they ask a series of questions about wasteful government programs before asking about spending in general, they're more likely to prime respondents to view spending negatively. It's like setting the stage for a particular response. They're subtly leading people down a certain path.
It's kind of sneaky, isn't it?
It can be. And then there's framing. Framing is all about using language to evoke specific emotions or associations. Think about the terms undocumented immigrant versus illegal alien. Both refer to the same thing, but they carry very different connotations. One sounds more neutral, while the other evokes fear and negativity.
It's amazing how powerful language can be.
It really is. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these potential biases when interpreting poll results. Those seemingly small choices in wording can have a big impact on how people respond.
Are there any other biases we should be on the lookout for?
Definitely. One is social desirability bias, where people might not answer truthfully if they think their opinion is unpopular. They want to present themselves in a positive light, even to an anonymous pollster.
It's like that old saying, don't ask a question you don't want the answer to.
Exactly. But in this case, it's more like, don't ask a question if people aren't going to answer it honestly. This ties into something called the Bradley effect, which suggests that some voters might say they'll vote for a minority candidate, but then actually vote differently in the privacy of the voting booth.
So they're not being completely truthful with the pollsters?
Right. They might be afraid to appear prejudiced, so they give the socially acceptable answer, and that can skew the results.
It really highlights how complex and nuanced public opinion can be. There's often a gap between what people say and what they actually do.
There is. And to complicate things further, we also have to consider the bandwagon effect, where people's opinions can be swayed by what others believe, especially in highly charged situations. Think about those moments when everyone suddenly becomes a fan of the winning team, even if they didn't care before.
Oh, I've totally seen that happen. It's like people want to be part of the in crowd.
It's a natural human tendency. And finally, there's the rally round the flag effect, which is when we see a surge in support for leaders during times of crisis. It's a natural response to unite behind a common cause, but it's important to remember that those surges are often temporary.
So public opinion is a pretty fickle thing.
It can be. It's constantly evolving and being shaped by all sorts of factors.
So while polls can be valuable tools for understanding these dynamics, it sounds like we need to approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Absolutely. Always think critically about where the data is coming from, how it was collected, and what potential biases might be at play.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about those large-scale surveys that track public opinion across different regions of the world. The chapter calls them barometers. It's like taking the pulse of entire continents.
Exactly. These barometers give us a fascinating glimpse into how people around the globe view key issues. They help us to move beyond those simplistic stereotypes and gain a more nuanced understanding of diverse regions.
The chapter goes into detail about several different barometers, but can we just highlight a few key ones? Like the Afrobarometer, for instance. What makes that one unique?
Well, as the name suggests, the Afrobarometer focuses specifically on the African continent. It gathers data from over 30 countries across Africa and covers a wide range of topics from democracy and governance to economic development, social issues, and people's lived experiences.
It must be really interesting to see how opinions vary across such a diverse continent.
It is. It gives us a much richer understanding of African perspectives than we typically get from Western media.
Yeah. What about the Middle East and North Africa? That region is obviously going through a lot of change and upheaval. I imagine public opinion there is pretty dynamic.
You're right, and that's where the Arab Barometer comes in. It explores opinions in over 15 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, diving into topics like social values, political trust, gender equality, and perceptions of the political system.
It sounds like the Arab Barometer provides a valuable window into a region that's often misunderstood.
It does, and it helps us to see beyond the headlines and get a sense of what people in the region are actually thinking and feeling.
Moving across continents, we have the Latino Barometer, which surveys people in 18 Latin American countries. What are some of the key issues they focus on?
The Latino Barometer is particularly interested in people's views of democracy, economic conditions, regional integration, and the role of government. They also look at issues like social trust corruption and crime. It gives us a really comprehensive picture of public opinion in Latin America.
It's interesting to see how these barometers are tailored to the specific concerns of each region. Are there any that take a more global perspective?
Yes. The World Values Survey, or WVS, takes a truly global approach, examining values and beliefs across a vast number of countries spanning every continent.
Wow, that's ambitious. What kind of insights can we glean from a survey that broad?
The WVS helps us to understand how cultures differ and how those differences might be changing over time. They look at a wide range of topics from attitudes towards democracy and religion to views on gender equality, environmental protection, and globalization.
It sounds like they cover just about everything. And the WVS also produced something called the Inglehart-Welzel Cultural Map.
Yes, that's a fascinating way to visualize cultural differences around the world. It essentially plots countries on a grid based on two key dimensions: traditional versus secular rational values, and survival versus self-expression values.
Can you break those down for us a bit? What exactly do those dimensions mean?
Sure, so traditional values emphasize things like religion, family, ties deference to authority and national pride. Secular rational values, on the other hand, prioritize reason, science, individual autonomy, and critical thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. What about survival versus self-expression?
Societies that focus on survival tend to prioritize economic and physical security. They're often more risk-averse and less tolerant of diversity or social change. But as societies develop and become more prosperous, they tend to shift towards self-expression values, prioritizing individual freedom, environmental protection, gender equality, and tolerance of diverse lifestyles.
It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs on a global scale. So the Inglehart-Welzel map shows how countries cluster based on these values. But what can this clustering tell us about potential areas of conflict or cooperation in the world?
That's a great question. It suggests that countries with similar values are more likely to find common ground on global issues, while those with vastly different values may face greater challenges in cooperating. For example, countries that prioritize individual freedom and self-expression may clash with those that emphasize traditional values and social order.
So it's not just about economic interests or military power. Cultural values also play a huge role in shaping global politics.
They absolutely do, and that's something that's often overlooked in traditional analyses of international relations.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from defining public opinion to exploring the challenges of measuring it and even mapping cultural differences across the globe. What are some key takeaways for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around this chapter on comparative public opinion? What are the big ideas they should be walking away with?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that understanding public opinion is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of politics both domestically and internationally. It's about more than just knowing what people think. It's about understanding why they think that way. And that why can be influenced by all sorts of factors, as we've seen, from personal experiences and cultural norms to global events and media narratives.
And those whys can be complex and multifaceted. It's not always easy to untangle all the different threads.
You're right. But that's what makes this field so fascinating. And as we've seen, measuring public opinion is both an art and a science. There are tools and techniques that can provide valuable insights, but it's crucial to be aware of those potential biases we talked about and to interpret polling data with a critical eye.
Don't just accept the numbers at face value. Think about the questions that were asked, how they were framed, who was surveyed, All of that matters.
Exactly. And don't forget about the broader context. Look at historical trends, cultural values, and the political landscape to get a more complete picture of what's driving public opinion.
It's like being a detective, piecing together clues to understand the complex world of political attitudes and beliefs.
I love that analogy. It really captures the spirit of inquiry that's at the heart of comparative public opinion research. It's an ongoing investigation, and the more we learn about public opinion, the more we understand about the forces that shape our world.
So it's an ongoing process of discovery. We're always learning new things about public opinion and how it shapes our world.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting. There's always more to explore and understand.
Well, on that note of exploration, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive on comparative public opinion. Until next time, happy studying, everyone.